Hello and welcome to India Speak, the Center for Policy Research's podcast series. This is the third in our special series titled India and the Pandemic, that is tracking the impact of the pandemic on different aspects of our economy, our polity, and our society. I'm Yamini Aiyar, and it's an absolute privilege for me today to be joined by Amit Basole, Associate Professor and Director of the Center for Sustainable Employment at the Azim Premji University. Amit and his colleagues have been closely tracking the impact of the pandemic on India's labor market, particularly looking at differential impact of the pandemic on employment opportunities across gender, across age, across types of employment, bringing together a range of surveys that give us a deep insight into the extent of damage and distress that the pandemic has caused to livelihoods across the country. Amit, a real privilege to have you here. Welcome to our podcast, and looking forward to an exciting conversation with you.
Thank you. Thank you, Yamini, very much for inviting me and look forward to the conversation.
So, Amit, let's start with requesting you to give our listeners a broad understanding of the nature of the labor market. We know broadly from big numbers that get thrown around in the public discourse that the bulk of India's employment is firmly in the informal sector. Often people talk about informal sector and the unorganized sector in one breath, but there are some specific differences which I was keen for you to just highlight to us, and to particularly give us a sense of how the formal and informal parts of the economy interact with each other. And the reason I'm asking you to give us this sense is because the pandemic didn't just hit an economy out of the blue, and its impact is not unique. Its impact is specifically embedded in the nature of the economy in of itself, something that we don't talk about enough. So just to give our listeners a broad understanding, if I could request you just to speak to us for a couple of minutes to give us the backdrop in which we then need to locate the shifts in labor market as a consequence of the pandemic.
Yeah. As you said, the common understanding is that the Indian economy, as far as the employment scenario is concerned, is largely an informal one, has been an informal one for a while. That still remains true. So we can think of terms of a couple of different ways. We can think of the scale of production, meaning how big or small are firms or farms for that matter in the economy. And we can think of it in terms of legal aspects, such as regulations, taxes, and those kinds of things. In both senses, what we see is that there has been a slow transformation in the Indian economy over the past few years. It's greater scale and greater formalization. That slowness has been the matter of concern. So in other words, the average Indian firm remains very tiny in size as far as the data allows us to see, and the average Indian worker remains, because they work in these tiny little firms, either self-employed, other kinds of casual or informal employment, they are bereft of most legal protections, minimum wage laws, working condition laws, various other things. So the structural transformation of the Indian economy remains a matter of big concern, was a matter of big concern even moving into the pandemic, before the pandemic. And one particular aspect of it was the lack of adequate job creation in the organized or the formal sector. So now again, those two words there. Organized refers mainly to the skill aspect, whether it's a large firm you're talking about, does it employ 20, 30, 40 people, 100 people, or is it a tiny firm, 1 or 2 people, 4 or 5 people? And formal, does it pay, does it regulate, and so forth. So the structural transformation of the Indian economy on both these dimensions has been weak. And self-employment, for example, continues to be about half of the Indian workforce, and that has not changed much, unfortunately, even in the last 10 or 20 years. That's our situation going into the pandemic.
Amit, can I ask you to reflect a little bit more for us on what is behind the dynamics of India's structural transformation, or rather India's extremely slow structural transformation? I ask this particularly because in many of our policy debates on the nature of the economy, and particularly on this question of the large presence of informality in the Indian economy, a lot of the policy emphasis has been on trying to find ways by which one can push formalization. A good example of that, for instance, is the GST, and to a lesser degree, I guess, demonetization at some point was sort of sold to the public as, amongst its multiple objectives, it could potentially accelerate formalization. But essentially, it does seem like efforts have been made through levers of policy to push deeper formalization. And yet, from what you describe and what we broadly know about the Indian economy, that process of formalization through these policy levers hasn't necessarily translated into significant shifts in the structure of the economy on the ground.
Yeah. So, if we just look at what structural transformation requires, what does historical experience, other countries' experience tell us? It requires the creation of employment opportunities which are more productive than what people have currently, in adequate numbers, such that you meet not only those new job seekers who are coming into, let's say, the labor force every year, but also the existing workers in agriculture and other kinds of small informal activities like petty retail. You are creating enough opportunities in some other more productive sectors to absorb these workforce. That's what structural transformation entails. And what the Indian economy has not been able to do successfully is to convert those high rates of GDP growth that we've experienced over several years into an adequate, into a mapping of those growth rates onto these employment opportunities. So we've seen high growth in some sectors, but those are not the sectors that are capable of creating employment opportunities in adequate numbers for the kind of workers and the profile, the education profile, etc., that is available. And GST demonetization and so forth can help at the margin, maybe. Demonetization, not really, I don't think would have helped, even the way it was conceived. It was a misguided policy. GST could, if properly implemented, but it's not going to substitute for the real work of economic transformation, which is what I outlined earlier.
So going into the pandemic, we had the endemic problems of a slow structural transformation, a fairly large informal economy dotted with small scale, micro to small firms, and a large population that did not have adequate legal protections, or rather a large working population that did not have adequate legal protections. But Amit, back in 2019, there was a lot of debate also about rising unemployment. That was a phenomenon that was appearing to have accelerated in the preceding years. Again, could you just give us a little bit of reflection on that?
Yes, very, very right. In fact, right before the pandemic, the Indian economy went through one of its most prolonged slowdowns since the 1991 reforms, as a matter of fact. So if you look at just the number of quarters during which the economy was slowing down in 2018 and 19, it was a very prolonged slowdown. So that had partly to do with it. The other was that there was a longer run problem as well, which was that once again the pace of job creation had not really been adequate compared to the new people entering the labor force. And there was between 2011-12 and 17-18, the two NSS PLFS rounds, there was a lot of literature already out there on how, in fact, the working age population increased 2 times what employment increased. right? So there was a huge increase in the number of people who would have wanted work, but they did not get work, with the result that the labor force participation rate fell, the unemployment rate rose, and so forth. Now, we don't have the time here to go into all the causes, but I'll also alert the listeners to the fact that these were the same years that saw, for example, the twin balance sheet crisis and the NPA crisis. So there's a lot of financial sector things that were going on which were affecting the real sector's ability to grow as well, that would feed into the employment story.
So essentially, before March 2020, we were in a world where endemic challenges of our structural transformation, or the dynamics of our structural transformation, our inability to create jobs, adequate jobs that were able to absorb the particular characteristics of the bulk of our labor force in the formal economy, combined with an accelerated slowdown, which partly also had features of problems within the financial sector that further accelerated the challenge. The pace of jobs didn't quite match the pace of population that was entering into the working age, bringing India to a place where unemployment rates were high and labor force participation rates were dropping significantly. And it's in this context that in late March 2020, the button of the economy was switched off. Unexpectedly, it had significant ripple effects on the labor market in India. The State of Working India report that the Center for Sustainable Employment, headed by Amit, along with his colleagues, brought out, really brings out a very, very detailed analysis of how the lockdown further impacted the labor market and the kind of effects it had on trends that were already visible before the pandemic. Amit, can I request you just very quickly give us some of the big highlights from the report, and then we'll dive into the details of some aspects of those, which I think will link us back to some parts of the conversation we've just had.
Yeah, sure. So I'll just go through some of the kind of qualitative findings. The numbers are all there in the report. What we saw expectedly was that the nationwide lockdown in April and May of last year, of course, had a huge impact in terms of sudden increase in the number of people who did not have work. By some estimates, going up to 120 million people lost work at that time. Much of that was temporary, because when the restrictions were lifted, many came back to work. But the disturbing thing that we found, and a lot of what I'm saying is based on the data from the Consumer Pyramid Survey of the CMIE, but also many other surveys that we and others have done. The disturbing thing was that even as late as December of 2020, employment was actually not back to its pre-pandemic levels in terms of number of people who were at work. And even April, the most recent data that we've looked at from CMIE from April 2021, employment was still below pre-pandemic levels, and so were incomes as of the most recent data we have, which is December 2020. So broadly, the shock of the lockdown caused persistent effects on employment as well as incomes for several months. And those costs were paid very regressively, meaning it's the poorest households that had the highest proportionate losses. For example, in April and May, their incomes dropped to zero. The poorest 20% of households earned no incomes at all. So if you look cumulatively over that 2020 year, then over 2 months of incomes were lost by the very households who could least afford to lose any income at all, because they had no savings, etc. to speak of to begin with, which we know, because we know that the wage levels were low going into the pandemic. So what happened as a result of that was an increase in indebtedness. In survey after survey, we saw that vulnerable households had been forced to borrow for very basic expenses, food, health, and so forth. They had been forced to sell their assets. They could not meet their rent obligations. They were being evicted. People had to reverse migrate, not only because they had lost work, but also because they couldn't afford rent and various things. So these are some of the big picture things that occurred. I'll just say one more thing, that we found that the different groups were affected very differently. So for example, women have been much worse affected in the pandemic along multiple indicators. Likelihood of losing work, inability to get back to work, a sudden increase in the hours spent in domestic responsibilities, mental health. Women have been far more disproportionately affected. Youth have been far more affected than older workers, again because they have a weaker attachment sometimes to the job market. They may be they may be the first to fire because they were last hired, less experienced, and so forth. So the pandemic has been very differential in its impacts, and the poorest and the women and the youth have paid the highest price for it.
So let's understand this a little bit more. Let's start with the issue that you brought up about women, or rather the differentiated gendered impact of the pandemic. We do know a little bit about the fact that India was, in any case, displaying a somewhat unique phenomenon of female labor force participation rates dropping even preceding the pandemic. And it does appear from what you've just told us that in some ways the pandemic then accelerated this problem. Could you tell us a little bit more about why this is? Both if you could help us by locating the challenge of female labor force participation within the Indian economy more broadly, and then specifically telling us what is it about the pandemic that accelerated this trend?
Yeah, this is again, of course, a very big question in Indian economic policy, and I'll just very briefly summarize the work of many people. Too many to mention here, who have done this kind of work over the past many years. You can identify both supply and demand side challenges to the problem of low labor force participation rate, which is an urban problem, and declining labor force participation rate, which is a rural problem. So these are two, but they're of course connected to each other. On the supply side, by which I mean the supply of women workers, of labor supply of women, there are well-known problems to do with asymmetric responsibilities for household work, patriarchal norms, social norms that don't allow women to go outside, to look very far for employment. So they are severely constrained in terms of what kind of work they can do. So there are these well-known problems on the supply side: safety, transport, and so forth. On the demand side, the economy has overall not been able to generate work for anyone, men as well as women, but particularly for women, it has not been able to generate enough employment opportunities commensurate with even the women who would like to work. So we have some recent survey evidence on this too, that it's not that women don't wish to work in paid employment. They very much do. Now they are constrained, as I said earlier, but there's simply nothing that they see themselves doing, given those constraints. That work doesn't exist. And we know that when we can create that work, they do participate in employment. So there are these various constraints. In the rural economy, there's a slightly different angle too, which is that there is an income effect going on, that as households improve their living conditions, a lot of the really backbreaking agricultural wage labor type of work women might withdraw from. And that's not something that necessarily we should be worried about, because if it is being substituted by them being able to do better work elsewhere, that would be a good thing. Of course, if that doesn't happen, then it's a concern we're about. So there are various dimensions here going into the pandemic that were already operating. What the pandemic has done is, first, of course, it punished women for all the reasons that we knew going in, which is that they have a weaker attachment to the labor market. They may have jobs that are more precarious, more informal in nature. They will also withdraw more readily if the domestic situation changes, while men won't. So they may tend to quit work for that reason. What we also know from prior to the pandemic is that there's a lot of flux in the data as far as women workers are concerned, meaning men tend to stay in employment. Women move in and out a lot of employment for reasons that are not entirely clear. So that also punishes them, because when they leave, they may not enter, but some other women perhaps enter. Right? So there's the overall, you can see that the workforce participation rate might be improving, but actually it's a flux underneath that is going on.
Yes, in fact, I remember in our conversations with Mahesh Vyas too on demonetization, he mentioned that we saw a significant drop in female labor force participation after demonetization. And even though the rates picked up in the years that followed, it was a new cohort of women that were gaining employment, not those that had dropped out of the labor force in the first place.
Right, exactly. And I think we've seen that very much in this pandemic too. So yeah, just to summarize, I mean, there is issues to do with informality. Women tend to be in more informal work. Sectoral balances questions are there. So women tend to be in sectors which might be more impacted, retail and so forth. And the whole domestic and household responsibilities dimension, they also get punished for. So all of that adds up to a fairly heavy toll that the pandemic has taken.
So I think, as we think about economic relief and recovery, this particular aspect of the impact of the pandemic on female labor force participation will probably need its own set of policy responses. We'll come to that shortly in our conversation. But I was keen to request you to reflect a little bit on another very, very stark finding from your analysis of the CPHS data, as well as the independent surveys, which is about the shift that we began to see in the labor market from the very tiny formal sector into the informal. Your data points out that a significant percentage of respondents who declared themselves to be salaried employees in the formal sector moved in to self-employment in the informal sector by self-declaration through the course of the pandemic last year. In a sense, further contributing to what several others have pointed out, to the profit-led recovery, where formal firms, large listed companies, seem to have done far better than small and informal firms. So could you just give us some of your reflections on this trend and what it means?
Yes, so thanks for bringing that up. In fact, I should have mentioned this right at the beginning as one of the big things that did occur over the last year, and probably is still happening since we are not out of it yet, is that there was an informalization of an already predominantly informal economy. And the CPHS data in particular allows us to follow formal sector workers, people who had formal jobs prior to the pandemic, through the pandemic, and alarmingly we found that half of them were no longer reporting themselves in formal work 1 year later, meaning around November, December 2020, they were no longer in formal work. They were either in self-employment or in salaried work, but of a more precarious kind, of a more temporary kind. So what we imagine happened, although we don't have all the details yet, is that when people lost work as a result of the upheaval of the lockdown and the depressed demand conditions that followed, when they came back to work, one of several things could have happened. They may have been rehired by the same firms but on worse terms, because employers now had the upper hand in the bargaining process. They at lower wages. They could have gone to work in a different sector entirely. All of us anecdotally would know of workers who had secure salaried jobs who were then doing something to get by. They were selling vegetables, or they were driving some tempo for hire, or whatever it is that they were trying to do to make ends meet, when earlier they might have had a 25,000-30,000 rupee, 40,000 rupees per month salaried job. These are not top tier workers. We're not talking about workers who earn lakhs and lakhs of rupees, but they would have had a secure livelihood. They wouldn't have thought of themselves as poor or vulnerable, but they did lose work. They did get shifted into the informal sector, and many of them fell below the national minimum wage poverty line, which also we have calculated, that an estimated 230 million individuals went below that. This line is not your usual poverty line; it's higher, but still, it's something that captures the basic standard of living that an individual should have. So, an alarming number of people have been pushed below that as a result of these processes of informalization and earnings drops. Final point to connect it to your profit-led recovery point. Going by whatever I see, and this is not my field, but going by whatever I see in the stock market, etc., it does appear that the slack labor market, which is the outcome of the pandemic, meaning that a lot of people out of work, informal work, and so forth, has really allowed firms that were able to do it to restructure their production, to reduce labor requirements, to repurpose, and to come back, more profitably. While other firms who were not so able to adapt, either because they're too small or in sectors that are not easy to adapt, have gone to the wall, have become bankrupt, and MSME sector bankruptcies have been rampant, and so forth. So we have seen a sort of a polarization, even on the firm side, not just the worker side or a household size of society, such that inequality has increased not only in terms of incomes, but also in terms of firm performances and outcomes.
I'm gleaning two really important policy points from what you're saying, which I hope we can come back to towards the end of our conversation. One, that when we think about India's social protection architecture, there's been a lot of focus on those sort of below, quote unquote, below the poverty line. We have a slightly more robust architecture for rural India, but we haven't paid enough attention to what the World Bank sort of defines as the vulnerable population, those who are one severe income shock away from moving back into poverty. I mean, my takeaway from what you've told us about the move from formal back into informal is that, in fact, absent that kind of protective web for those in that vulnerable population, which the bank's number was about 50% of India's population. Of course, this is based on 2011 data. But it does seem that the absence of a social protection net for the vulnerable population is partially, at least, responsible for this push back into poverty of the 230 million number that you described. So there's a question about what we need to do in the context of our social protection architecture for vulnerable populations, and the other, of course, is how do we address the long-term consequence of this shift in the formal and informal firms, as formal firms seem to have restructured and potentially benefited in arenas where smaller informal firms had a market. But we'll come to that in a moment, because I do want you to reflect a little bit more on the third very important point that you made in the state working India, which is about the loss of income. And as your findings highlight, that a good 2 months of income were lost by households in the bottom 20%. Now, of course, that's going to have had a significant impact on consumption and demand. And I assume particularly these are households, because of reverse migration, that are now largely visible in rural India. And so rural demand, which many commentators and I think economists within the government particularly felt had sort of stayed robust through last year, is likely to get quite deeply impacted against the backdrop of the loss of income from last year and potential continued loss of income for this year.
Yeah. So, I mean, absolutely. I think the big question now going forward from the second wave is, what will happen to the rural economy, since the rural areas were much more affected this time around directly by the pandemic as well. But yes, the loss of income that we have seen, and it's not only a total loss that happens during, let's say, lockdown periods where people earn nothing or almost nothing, but also in the rest of the time when the restrictions are not really in full force, but the pandemic has altered people's movements, people are not moving around as much, they are voluntarily restricting themselves, and so forth. All of that has knock-on multiplier effects of the negative kind. And my really big concern going forward is that we are not really capturing the full extent of the demand contraction. Things like the official GDP numbers. I mean, the official numbers are also bad, obviously, but given that they don't adequately capture what happens in the informal sector, I fear that the contraction may actually be much higher in size. And if we don't do a serious job of estimating what that is, properly at the national level, and instead rely only on a business as usual GDP numbers, then we may have a silent crisis that persists, because we won't undertake any measures. Since we're not seeing it as a problem, we won't do anything about it. And I hope that doesn't happen, because that can have prolonged consequences.
Well, I mean, in a sense, this feeds into a larger question of whether or not we are at a policy level within government actually tracking in a careful and minute level the impact of the pandemic on different aspects of the economy. It does say something that the state of working India has had to rely on private data like CMIE, your own surveys. Not that that's a bad thing. I think it's important to have a lot of robust surveys done by research institutions, by civil society. But there is a glaring silence in terms of government data and how the government is viewing the problem.
Yeah, so yeah, as you also know, the public data aspect has been much in the news in the last few years. Now, I do think that the PLFS institutionalization was a great thing, and it 2 years of data came out. This year, I'm not very sure what will happen because of the pandemic, but yes, I mean, yeah, it's hard to deny the point that we should be taking the generation of real time or some sort of high frequency data seriously, from a variety of sources. So I think what we are good at is a lot of this sort of firm end or app based or other kinds of data are available, and I think those are used quite a bit in official policy making too now. But those are not substitutes for good household surveys. I often say this, that people tend to sometimes poo-poo household surveys, saying, well, why do you want to trust people on what they're saying when you can get all this other administrative data and data on what they're actually doing, which is good. I mean, all of that data is also good to have, but it really is very self-selected in most ways, right? You're looking at a particular kind of population that is either part of a database like EPFO or uses a particular app or whatever. It's only really household surveys where we know how to reach a truly random representative population, which might be part of no digital circuit at all, right? And to know, and those are significant in numbers. So I think even in the past year, I know that many things were going on, and policy priorities, there were not few in number. So perhaps this didn't really quite make it to the list, but it would have been good to have a running random, if nothing, a phone survey, an official one, that kept good track. I mean, the Labour Bureau did commission some new surveys, which hopefully will come out on migrant workers, domestic workers, and a few others. But so I'm looking forward to getting those numbers. But yes, I think more could have been done, but it's still not too late. I think the big point I'm making is that if we learn to interpret our GDP numbers together with a good high frequency measure of the informal sector output and income, we will go a long way in making policies that are much more sensitive. Demonetization also, same thing happened. Because we relied on the official GDP statistics, we just never found out what the informal sector contraction really looked like. And to this day, we don't know that. So with demonetization, with GST, and with the pandemic, a huge part of the micro enterprise sector and the informal economy has had multiple shocks, which we just don't have a good understanding. And this should not be the case, for intelligent policy making.
Amit, you take me to exactly where I was hoping this conversation would reach. We've already, in some sense, gleaned the first most important policy step that needs to be taken in light of where we are today, which, as you rightly say, has to be identifying ways of developing high frequency indicators to better understand and measure what's happening in the informal economy. But can I ask you to sort of stepping away from what we know to reflect a little bit on now on what else we need to do in terms of policy to both address the immediate crises as it's far from over, but also the larger challenge of what are the critical things we should at least be debating in the policy world, that would help as we get into a framework of economic recovery, enable us to at least use this potentially as an opportunity to address some of the endemic challenges of our structural transformation. So first, just your reflections on what needs to be done immediately basis from your work. I can immediately see at least three areas that we need more careful focus policy. One on the issue of the gender differential, the expanded informality, as well as potentially perhaps picking up and tackling head on the demand challenge. But very keen to learn from you. And then we can close with a discussion on the larger question that I am posing to you on what here can we learn so that our debates on recovery don't fall into the very traps that created this slow structural transformation in the first place.
So starting with the immediate one, of course, I'm obviously setting aside the vaccination program and the immediate health responses, which we don't say much about in the report. But the fact remains that that is a huge demand stimulus, because that's going to create the confidence for reopening the economy. So that goes without saying. Other than vaccination and so forth, I think the demand issue is tied up very closely to the compensating people for their losses and relief issue. They go together. And here, I think the standard thing of food plus cash plus work should really be our approach in the immediate term. So food, as you know, last night was announced, has been the PDS extension has been announced till November, which is a good thing. We had called for the end of the year, but November is fine for now. And a further round of cash transfers will go again a long way if they are substantive enough. I mean, they need to be bigger than what have been done so far to compensate people for those lost incomes that we discussed, to help them to pay down some debts, and then to bring back demand as well. And NREGA as well as an urban employment scheme would both go a long way when unlocking starts to create work at the lower end of the labor market. So all of these things, I think, which we discuss in the report in more detail, are all good immediate actions that can be taken. We've also talked about special allowances, hardship allowances for frontline workers and so forth, which again have the dual purpose of shoring up demand, but also acknowledging the important contribution of these workers. Coming to the gender aspect, I think this is a crucial point, and this connects to your long-term agenda as well, because what we need to think about is a way to mainstream gender into our employment policy thinking. First, we need a national employment policy, which I think from news reports, I'm told there are discussions going on in the central government on one such policy, but I haven't seen any details. And that national employment policy needs to have gender thoroughly integrated in it, so that we are thinking from every dimension, from the supply of labor, demand for labor, public demand, private demand. How do we incentivize private firms to hire women workers? How do we invest in public goods and public transit, etc., which will improve the supply of female labor? What role can public employment play, since we are undersupplying social infrastructure like health and education? What can the expansion of those public goods, which I know you think a lot about, what can that do to improve women's employment? So there are many things that we can do which can really address 2 or 3 problems all at once, right? The undersupplying of public goods, the lack of female labor force participation, low productivity of small firms. These are all interconnected problems that can be solved through a massive, public push. It doesn't require only spending. I mean, spending is part of it, but it also requires policy coordination of a certain kind. So I'm going now a little bit into the long-term agenda, but I'll pause here to see follow up.
No, absolutely. I think this is exactly where I wanted the conversation to go and what we wanted to learn from. But could you also reflect a little bit more on the interlinkages of formal, informal, and how you see a national employment policy sort of trying to bridge that? so that we don't end up in a world where once again we almost sort of use a butcher's knife to push for formality in the Indian economy through policy as a tool, without really looking at the intersections of the formal and the informal.
Yeah. So, I think we need to clearly think about what do we mean when we want firms to be formal, right? Now, like anything else, a firm owner is responding to their constraints and incentives, and people need to see a value in, for example, reporting their statistics to the government, or paying their taxes, or following rules and regulations. They need to see that this enables them to do something that they otherwise cannot. And what we have very often is rather the opposite, which is that people see value in not becoming formal, staying smaller, avoiding regulation in various ways, expanding but in a way that evades regulation. All of these things we all know very well happen in the economy. So firms expand, but they rather than becoming one large firm, they become four small firms, right? And so forth. Everybody maintains two books and all that. So the state, unfortunately, often is seen as a predatory entity, as an entity that is out there to give you trouble and eat into your profits and not give you anything in return. Now, unless that perception changes and the state is seen as an enabler, as somebody who is taking something from you, but for a good reason, for it's giving you good public goods, your roads look fine, you don't have to replace the tires on your tempo, every 2 years, because just getting from your godown to, the market is wearing out your vehicle or something like that. These are very small transactions costs which add to huge macro consequences because we have underinvested in many of these
Amit,
things. So,
here's a challenge, right? Which is, you rightly say that the state is viewed as predatory, and we have to. The state has to shift towards building trust and being understood as an enabler, not as a predator. But often the discourse in India, in particular, when it comes to it recognizes the predatory elements of the state, but the response always is, well, we just have to get the state out of the way. And I think that's sort of where we end up stuck in a sense. If you look at the sort of post 1991 discourse, it was always about sort of India sleeps, India grows at night when the state sleeps. But we never really adequately tackle the question of what does it mean for the state to be an enabler? Is it about the state getting out of the way, or is it about the state reinventing itself or building its capabilities differently?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think this is not an easy question to answer. We have so many years, decades of economic debates over this issue.
Quite.
But yes, I think that we should remember in our public discourse, especially because we get tempted to compare ourselves to Western Europe and America a lot, right? And in terms of the state market balances and so forth, is that those economies are sitting on top of decades of massive investments in public goods before they got to the point that we see them today. Right? And even their debates on whether the welfare state has gone too far, etc., are on a very different scale and history than ours. We simply haven't made those investments in the first place. So I often feel that we are having these debates too soon. To me, it's a no-brainer that there needs to be massive public investment in things that we have continuously underinvested in. And here we need more of the state. And I think not even entrepreneurs really contest that idea, because they are paying the price for bad water supply, bad electric supply, bad roads, bad internet. They pay the cost daily. Now, if you were to improve those things, they would be thankful for it, as would ordinary citizens if you gave them good services in healthcare. And what you mentioned, that they were not one health crisis away from bankruptcy. All of this, I think people would appreciate, and they do appreciate it. We know that even in India, if we compare the diversity of how public goods work, then we know that there are countries, there are states where people are appreciative of their public institutions that work well, and they realize the value of those institutions. So, it's not an easy thing to figure out where that line lies between a state that is too much in your face and one that wants to make life better for you. But I think we are very far in many dimensions from having enough let me put it this way, of public goods. In other ways, we are too much in the face. So, I mean, that's what really makes this a very hard problem to solve, because we do know that on the streets, when the municipal or police officials harass street vendors for bribes, that's not the kind of state that we want to see. Right? Instead, we want to see them legalized. We want to see them getting electricity connections and water connections so that they can actually do work and businesses grow their businesses in a peaceful way. So and then, the kind of policies which force, either through demonetization or other kinds of things, I think just bring out the kind of inherent suspiciousness of the state that we have, right? Because of our history with the predatory nature, which backfires then, because people figure out how to cheat and figure ways around it and so forth. So I'm not saying that I have a solution to any of this, but I'm saying that we need to reset the debate to some extent, that we are very far from having enough of state investment.
Absolutely. I think that's that's a very good point for us to close our conversation. The urgent need to reset the terms of our debates, the recognition that a state that doesn't invest in core public goods is a state that's not doing its job. And the push has to be to get the state to do more rather than to get the state to get out of the way, in the hope that the market will fill the gaps of government failure. And I think if there's one lesson that perhaps we can learn from the traumas of the last year and a half almost, it is that we need a stronger, better state, a capable state, not a state that gets out of the way and abdicates from its responsibilities. Amit Basole, thank you so much for joining us. It's, as always, been an enlightening conversation. We've traversed various core and critical debates of the Indian economy, and you did so by summarizing the core elements of the debate so well, and translating complex policy and economic debates into easy to understand terms. So thanks for that education. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you very much, Yamini, for giving me the opportunity. It was a pleasure.
Thank you for listening. For more on CPR's work on COVID-19, you can follow us on our Twitter handle at CPR_India and visit our website at www.cprindia.org.